Have you ever noticed how the most conscious people of our time seem to carry an invisible weight? Those individuals who observe the world with greater clarity, who see beyond collective illusions, often experience a peculiar form of suffering that they rarely share with others. It is an intriguing phenomenon, deeply revealing about our contemporary condition. While much of society navigates life absorbed in daily distractions, there is a group of people for whom expanded consciousness has become both a blessing and a curse. They are the ones who perceive broader patterns, who question dominant narratives, who feel the contradictions of our time with unusual intensity, and this sharpened perception comes with a significant emotional cost that is paradoxically usually endured in silence. Why does this happen? Why do those who see more clearly also suffer more quietly? This is a question that touches something essential about the nature of human consciousness and about how we live in this particular historical moment. By exploring this phenomenon, we can discover not only the roots of this silent suffering, but also possible paths to transform it into something more constructive and perhaps even liberating. The relationship between expanded consciousness and suffering is not new in human history. We can find its echoes over millennia in different cultures and traditions. In ancient Greece, we have Plato's cave myth, where the one who manages to break free and see the real world beyond the shadows returns to the cave only to be ridiculed and rejected by those who remain chained to illusions. Socrates himself, with his relentless pursuit of truth through questioning, found not only social resistance, but also death as the final response of Athenian society to his uncomfortable awakening. Prophets in religious traditions are often portrayed as solitary figures, carrying visions that separate them from the community and condemn them to live as foreigners among their peers. Even in the Middle Ages, we find mystics and philosophers whose expanded perception placed them in dangerous positions against institutions of power, often forcing them to hide their real perceptions or communicate them only in very restricted circles. The pattern is consistent. Those who see beyond collective illusions often experience not only the burden of that vision, but also the isolation it brings. However, what we are witnessing today has unique characteristics that intensify this dynamic. We live in an era of unprecedented informational overload, where our attention has become the most disputed resource of the economy. Our devices and digital platforms have been meticulously designed to capture and hold our focus, fragmenting our perception into small shards of partial attention. This scenario creates an even deeper division between those who manage to maintain integrated consciousness, perceiving broader patterns of reality, and those who get lost in the constant flow of disconnected stimuli. The most conscious not only see beyond the illusions of their time and culture, as their historical equivalents did, but also must actively resist increasingly sophisticated mechanisms designed to colonize and fragment their attention. This demands a cognitive and emotional effort without historical precedent. At the same time, our society has developed an impressive ability to absorb and neutralize criticism, transforming potentially revolutionary insights into harmless consumer products. The very tools that could promote a collective awakening are quickly incorporated into the system they were meant to challenge. Consider how concepts like mindfulness, originally part of deep spiritual traditions aimed at freeing the mind from illusions, were reduced to corporate productivity techniques and meditation apps that mainly promise stress reduction so we can function better within the same system. The most conscious perceive this cooptation and feel the frustration of seeing tools of liberation turned into new mechanisms of control. This awareness becomes yet another layer of their silent pain. Another crucial aspect is that our contemporary social structures offer few legitimate spaces for the kind of deep questioning that expanded consciousness naturally generates. In ancient societies, figures such as shamans, prophets, philosophers, or mystics had recognized roles, even if often marginalized. There was an understanding that certain people would function as the extended eyes of society, seeing beyond the immediate horizon. Today, we fragment knowledge into such narrow specializations that we lose the ability to integrate broad visions. An economist should not speak about psychology. A physicist should not philosophize about ethics. An artist should not theorize about politics. Those with perceptions that cross these artificial boundaries often find no institutional place to express their integrated visions. This lack of social recognition for expanded consciousness contributes significantly to the silence of those who possess it. There is also a particular phenomenon related to digital technology and social networks that intensifies the silent suffering of the most conscious. Digital platforms, with their engagement algorithms, tend to reward emotional extremes and polarized positions. Nuanced ideas, complex perceptions, and uncomfortable truths that do not fit neatly into established ideological camps are often ignored or actively suppressed by the design of these systems. Those who perceive nuances, contradictions, and truths that transcend simplistic dichotomies discover that their voices are systematically marginalized by the very architecture of our main communication platforms. Watching this mechanism in action day after day, while simplistic narratives dominate public discourse, creates a particular form of exhaustion and hopelessness among the most conscious. It is like being trapped in a conversation where only the loudest screams are heard, while essential whispers are completely lost. The relationship between consciousness and pain has even deeper roots in the nature of the human mind itself. To understand this, consider how our nervous systems work. Physical pain exists as an essential warning system, signaling current or potential harm to the organism. In a similar way, we can think of emotional and existential pain as alert systems for our social and psychological being. The greater the consciousness, the more refined this warning system becomes, capable of detecting subtle misalignments and contradictions that would go unnoticed by a less attentive mind. The most conscious are like those with extraordinarily acute hearing, living in a noisy city, or people with exceptional smell sensitivity working in a sewage treatment station. They detect dissonances that others simply cannot perceive. And this constant perception becomes a source of chronic suffering that is not easily understood by those around them. At the same time, there is an evolutionary aspect to this dynamic that deserves consideration. In hunter-gatherer societies that shaped our psychology for hundreds of thousands of years, expanded consciousness likely offered significant survival advantages for the group, even if at individual cost for those who possessed it. The member of the tribe who was constantly attentive to subtle patterns of change in the environment, who questioned established routines when perceiving risks ignored by others, who imagined possibilities beyond the immediate horizon, offered vital contributions to the adaptability and survival of the group as a whole. However, this same hypersensitivity to problems, risks, and contradictions likely came with greater individual suffering. This balance between collective benefit and individual cost may explain why expanded consciousness, with its associated pain, persists in the human population, even when often disadvantageous for subjective individual well-being. But why the silence? Why do those who feel the contradictions of our time most deeply often carry this burden without expressing it openly? There are multiple layers in this silence that deserve exploration. First, there is the very real fear of social rejection. Our societies, despite all rhetoric about individuality and freedom of expression, exert powerful pressure for conformity of thought. Those who question fundamental narratives often face not only intellectual disagreement, but social alienation. We are, after all, tribal animals, and ostracism remains one of the most painful experiences we can face. The most conscious often learn through painful experiences that sharing certain perceptions results in rejection, ridicule, or marginalization. Silence becomes a strategy of social survival. There is also the problem of communication itself. Many of the deepest perceptions about our condition resist easy articulation in everyday language. How can one adequately express the perception of systemic contradictions that manifest in countless domains of experience? How can one effectively communicate insights that challenge not only specific ideas, but the very conceptual frameworks we use to organize thought? Language, with all its limitations, and loaded with cultural assumptions, often seems inadequate to convey perceptions that transcend established consensus. This difficulty in articulation contributes significantly to the silence of those who see beyond conventional boundaries of thought. Another aspect of silence relates to perceived responsibility. The most conscious often feel that their darkest or most disturbing perceptions, if shared indiscriminately, could cause unnecessary suffering to others. There is a paradoxical compassion in withholding certain truths when one perceives that they could not be constructively integrated by listeners. Like a doctor who carefully calibrates how much of a difficult diagnosis to share with a patient at different stages of their journey, the most conscious often consider the potential impact of their perceptions on others and choose silence as an act of care, not cowardice. Modern technology adds yet another dimension to this phenomenon. We live in an era of unprecedented surveillance, where our digital communications are constantly monitored, analyzed, and potentially used against us, whether by corporations, governments, or even by socially driven mechanisms amplified by algorithms, those with enough consciousness to perceive the risks of expressing ideas that challenge powerful established interests often choose self-censorship as a measure of self-preservation. It is no coincidence that historically, authoritarian regimes have prioritized targeting intellectuals, artists, and independent thinkers. Expanded consciousness has always represented a threat to systems of power that depend on uncritical acceptance of official narratives. In the digital age, this dynamic intensifies through more subtle but no less effective mechanisms of control and suppression. There is also an economic dimension to this silence. In a society where material survival is intimately tied to participation in economic systems that may be fundamentally incompatible with the values and perceptions of the most conscious, expressing certain truths can have significant material consequences. Losing jobs, professional opportunities, or social status for expressing fundamental criticism of the systems that sustain our material existence is a real risk. Thus, many of those with deeper perceptions of the contradictions of our time find themselves in an impossible position to participate in systems they consider problematic in order to survive materially while keeping their most critical perceptions silent to avoid economic repercussions. This constant cognitive dissonance between internal perception and external expression becomes yet another layer of silent suffering. However, perhaps the deepest and most disturbing aspect of this silence is the existential loneliness it generates. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, and our sense of reality is largely co-constructed through mutual validation. When we perceive aspects of reality that those around us do not recognize or actively deny, we experience a particularly painful form of isolation. It is like living in a parallel reality, partially disconnected from the shared social world. This experience of ontological misalignment, of inhabiting a perceptual world that finds no external validation, creates a unique form of suffering that transcends conventional psychological categories. It is not depression, anxiety, or any other easily classifiable diagnosis, but a pain born from the very act of seeing clearly in a world that prefers the comforting fog of shared illusions. It is also important to recognize that not all expanded consciousness necessarily leads to silent suffering. There are forms of heightened awareness that are celebrated and rewarded in our society, particularly those that can be channeled into technological innovation, competitive advantage, or consumable entertainment. A brilliant programmer who sees patterns others do not may become a billionaire in Silicon Valley. A financial analyst with exceptional perception of emerging trends may be richly rewarded on Wall Street. A filmmaker who captures social contradictions in accessible and commercially viable ways may gain acclaim and influence. The problem is not every form of sharpened perception, but specifically those perceptions that fundamentally challenge the power structures, cultural assumptions, and economic arrangements that sustain the current social order. It is this particular type of expanded consciousness, the one that questions the very foundations of the system, instead of merely operating more efficiently within it, that most often results in silent suffering. What then would be the path forward for those who carry this burden? How can the most aware navigate a world that often resists their deepest perceptions? First, it may be necessary to recognize the intrinsic value of this form of consciousness, despite the suffering it brings. In a world facing multiple existential crises, from ecological collapse to the risks of new disruptive technologies, we desperately need people capable of seeing beyond reassuring narratives and identifying fundamental problems before they become catastrophic. The pain of the most conscious can be an essential warning system for society as a whole, signaling misalignments and contradictions that, if ignored, may lead to devastating consequences. Recognizing this role can transform the meaning of suffering, making it not only a personal burden, but a necessary form of service, even if unrecognized, to the broader human community. Furthermore, those who experience this particular form of expanded consciousness may benefit greatly from finding others with similar experiences. Throughout history, communities of thinkers, artists, philosophers, and visionaries created small enclaves where perceptions that challenged the dominant consensus could be shared, refined, and integrated. Today, despite the limitations and risks of digital platforms, there are new possibilities for creating spaces where the most conscious can break their isolation and find validation for their perceptions. These encounters, whether physical or virtual, offer not only relief from existential loneliness, but also opportunities to transform individual perceptions into more robust collective understandings and potentially into coordinated actions for positive change. It is also worth considering the possibility that we are on the threshold of significant changes in collective consciousness. Moments of deep crisis often catalyze awakenings that once seemed impossible. As the limits and contradictions of our current systems become increasingly evident through converging crises, perceptions that were once marginalized may find more receptive audiences. Stories of profound social transformation often include periods in which ideas previously considered radical or unthinkable quickly became the new common sense. Those who kept these ideas alive during times of resistance and rejection played an essential role in providing conceptual seeds that could blossom when conditions changed. The silence of the most conscious may then not be a permanent state, but a necessary incubation phase for insights the world is not yet ready to fully receive. It is also important to recognize the potentially transformative role of art, literature, music, and other forms of creative expression in this context. Throughout history, art has served as a vehicle for communicating difficult truths in ways that bypass intellectual resistance and reach people at deeper levels than rational arguments. A powerful novel, a visually striking film, or an emotionally resonant song can convey perceptions that would be rejected if presented as direct propositions. For many of the most conscious, creative expression offers a path to break the silence without incurring the risks associated with more explicit communication. Metaphor, allegory, and aesthetic expression can serve as bridges between perceptual realities, allowing difficult truths to be shared in ways that minimize resistance and maximize receptivity. In addition, we may consider the possibility that the suffering associated with expanded consciousness may itself serve as a catalyst for deeper personal growth and spiritual development. Many contemplative traditions suggest that suffering, when encountered with presence and acceptance, can open doors to even deeper dimensions of understanding and compassion. The pain of seeing clearly may paradoxically be the very portal to forms of consciousness that transcend the duality of suffering and joy. From this perspective, the challenge is not so much to eliminate the suffering associated with expanded consciousness, but to alchemically transform it into fuel for an even deeper awakening that can benefit not only the individual, but all those whose lives they touch. I want to pause for a moment to ask, do you also feel this deep disconnection in your daily life? This sense that even though we are more connected than ever through technology, something essential was lost along the way? I know it can be hard to put into words. Many of us carry this weight in silence, believing we are the only ones who feel this particular emptiness. But you are not alone in this. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, "I feel this disconnection when," filling in with your personal experience. Your comment may be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel that they are not alone in their struggle. Sometimes, naming what we feel is the first step toward transforming it. The issue of the silent pain of the most conscious also invites us to re-examine our understanding of mental health on individual and collective levels. In a society that increasingly pathologizes difficult emotional states and seeks pharmacological solutions to silence symptoms rather than address underlying causes, there is a real danger of classifying the pain associated with expanded consciousness simply as a psychological disorder to be treated and eliminated. However, this approach ignores the possibility that certain kinds of suffering may be completely appropriate responses to genuinely problematic circumstances. Psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl argued convincingly that the search for meaning, not the search for happiness, is the primary motivation in human life. From this perspective, the suffering associated with clear perception of difficult truths may be not a symptom of dysfunction, but an integral part of a life lived with depth and authenticity in challenging times. In addition, there is an important temporal aspect to consider. Frequently, those with more expanded consciousness are essentially living in a perceptual future, detecting emerging patterns and long-term consequences that have not yet fully manifested in the immediate present. This temporal asynchrony creates a particular form of alienation where one lives psychologically in a different time from those around them. Like the biblical prophet Cassandra, cursed with the ability to foresee the future but never be believed, many of the most conscious carry the weight of perceptions that time has not yet validated for others. This position between times, where one perceives current trajectories and their probable destinations, while the majority remains focused only on the present moment, creates a particular loneliness and a sense of responsibility that can be overwhelming. Digital technology, particularly artificial intelligence, adds another fascinating dimension to this discussion. As we develop systems increasingly capable of detecting patterns and correlations in vast datasets, we are essentially creating machines with limited forms of expanded consciousness in specific domains. A deep learning algorithm analyzing climate data may see emerging patterns of environmental change that would escape even the most attentive climatologists. AI systems analyzing social networks may detect emerging cultural trends long before they become evident to human observers. This raises profound questions. Could we use these technologies as extensions of our own collective consciousness, as tools to validate and amplify the perceptions of the most conscious among us? Or, conversely, will these technologies only accentuate the division between different levels of consciousness, creating new forms of knowledge reserved only for those with access and control over these systems? Education represents another critical area for consideration. Our current educational systems, with their focus on standardization, memorization, and preparation for existing job markets, often fail to nurture or even actively suppress forms of expanded consciousness. Children who naturally question, who are sensitive to contradictions, and who are attentive to dimensions of experience beyond the material and measurable, often find little support for developing these qualities. Instead, they are implicitly or explicitly encouraged to narrow their perceptual focus to accommodate institutional expectations, reimagining education as a process that deliberately cultivates multiple forms of consciousness, including those that may generate discomfort by challenging established assumptions, could be essential for developing the perceptual and integrative capacities to our species will need to navigate the complex challenges we face. Perhaps the most hopeful aspect of this exploration is the recognition that despite all the suffering associated with it, expanded consciousness also brings with it extraordinary possibilities for fulfillment, connection, and meaningful contribution. Many of those who carry this burden also experience moments of clarity, beauty, and interconnection that transcend the ordinary. The same sensitivity that detects painful dissonances also allows one to experience sublime harmonies when they are present. The ability to see broader patterns, to integrate diverse perspectives, and to imagine possibilities beyond the status quo are precisely the qualities needed to conceive and manifest alternatives to the dysfunctional systems that currently dominate our collective existence. In this sense, the pain of the most conscious is not only a burden to be endured, but potentially the crucible in which new ways of being, both individual and collective, can be forged. Ultimately, the question of the silent pain of the most conscious invites us to fundamentally reimagine our relationship with knowledge, perception, and truth. In an age where your truth and my truth have replaced the common search for shared understanding, where narratives are evaluated primarily for their strategic usefulness rather than their correspondence to reality, those who maintain an unshakable commitment to clear perception often find themselves in increasingly isolated territory. Yet, it is precisely this commitment that can offer a path through the converging crises we face as a species. as Václav Havel, the playwright who became president, wrote during Soviet oppression, living in truth can be the most revolutionary force available in times where systems of power depend on collective acceptance of falsehoods. In our individual lives, we can begin by honoring our own capacity for expanded consciousness, even when it brings discomfort. We can seek others who share our levels of perception and create spaces where difficult truths can be articulated and integrated. We can develop contemplative practices that allow us to remain present with the suffering that clarity sometimes brings, transforming it into compassion instead of cynicism or despair. And we can find ways to express and share our deepest perceptions in ways that can be received by those who are ready to hear them, recognizing that collective consciousness evolves gradually, often at slower rhythms than we would like. Socially, we can work to create structures that value and incorporate multiple levels of consciousness, recognizing that different perspectives and sensitivities are necessary for a truly healthy and resilient society. We can imagine educational, economic, political, and cultural institutions that not only tolerate, but actively nurture divergent voices and unconventional perceptions. And we can contribute to a culture that honors truth, even when uncomfortable, as a necessary foundation for facing complex challenges with integrity and collective wisdom. If these reflections have touched on something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space of dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. The history of human consciousness is a journey of continuous expansion, punctuated by moments of contraction and resistance. The silent suffering of the most conscious in our time can be seen not as an anomaly or a purely personal tragedy, but as part of this broader rhythm of collective evolution. The pain that accompanies clear vision has always preceded significant transformations in human understanding. Like the labor that precedes birth, this suffering may be not only inevitable, but necessary for the emergence of new paradigms of perception and organization. Those who endure this pain today, keeping alive the possibility of more integrated and compassionate consciousness, are serving as midwives for a future we cannot yet see clearly, but that we can feel emerging through the cracks in the old world. In this light, the silence of the most conscious may be not an end, but a pause, pregnant with possibilities, a moment of inspiration before a new collective expression that is only beginning to find its voice.
Philosophers like Charles Taylor and psychologists and others, they looked into this kind of mental atom of the self and realized, like the physical atom, it's not solid at all. It contains not just multitude of subparticles, but they are constantly moving and interacting and changing.
Did it help you understand something about yourself?
Yes, that and what I define as myself itself needs a lot more exploration. You think you know yourself, but you don't. Not just, the kind of individual events of your life. Your very understanding of what is a self is far from self-evident. And it is itself the product of a lot of stories and mythologies which are not necessarily true.
It's usually the people who know how to weave a story that give orders to the people who merely know the facts. Suppose we want to build an atom bomb. You need to know some facts. If you don't know that E equals mc squared, you will not be able to build an atom bomb. But to build an atom bomb, you need something else. You need millions and millions of people to cooperate. Not just the physicists, but also the miners and builders and the farmers that feed all the physicists and engineers and miners and so forth. If you just tell them the facts of physics, look, E equals mc squared, now get to it, nobody would do it. It's not inspiring. You always need to tell them some kind of fiction. And the people who invent the fictions are far more powerful than the people who know the facts of physics.
So what is the most common portrait in the world? What is the most famous face in the history of humanity? It is the face of Jesus. I mean, there are more portraits of Jesus than of any other person in the history of the world. Billions and billions produced over centuries in cathedrals and churches and homes, and fully 100% of them are fictional. There is not a single authentic, truthful portrait of Jesus anywhere. We have no portrait of him from his own lifetime. The Bible doesn't say a single word about how he looked like. There is not a single word in the Bible, whether Jesus was tall or short, dark hair or blonde or bald, nothing. All the images, and it's one of the most famous faces in history, it all comes from the human imagination. And it's still very successful in inspiring people and uniting people. Could be for good purposes, charity and building hospitals and helping the poor, but could also be for bad purposes, crusades, persecutions, inquisitions. But either way, the immense power of a fictional image to unite people.